To begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, I would like to also pay my respect to elders past and present. So as the title of this meeting suggests, is about the quarterly business review, or the QBR, and I'm Yu Yan, your host today. So probably like many people in this room today, you probably heard bits and pieces about QBR. I certainly heard about QBR a number of years ago, around the legendary stories of how companies like LinkedIn, ING Bank used things like QBR to keep the organization agile and keep their people aligned. But what really got me into QBR was actually back in 2020 when the COVID lockdown happened. That's when a lot of people picked up, obviously, Netflix to keep themselves entertained. And at the same time, I picked up a book from the co-founder and CEO of Netflix, the No Rules Rule. So the CEO, Reed Hastings, actually dedicated a whole chapter in the book about leading with context and not control, and gave a specific example of when he found out one of his leadership team make probably a silly decision. But rather than being angry at him or trying to correct that specific act, he actually used the next QBR to set better context. So by doing that, he not only trying to benefit that one person, he actually shared information more openly, broadly, and deliberately with the entire organization. And that helped Netflix become such a successful company, and by encouraging decision-making at the employee level. So Reed actually painted the picture of QBR in such a compelling way that I was actually ready to implement it in the company that I was working for. But then that's also when the reality hits, right? So QBR itself is actually quite a well-described mechanism in a lot of kind of corporate studies, but how it's implemented and the impact you will get from that very much depends on the people, the culture, the systems, and the things you have in the organization today. And like many things in business, it's also pretty much an evolving beast. And that's why today we invited two experts from very different types of companies to come talk about their experience about QBR, given their firsthand experience designing, living, and evolving QBR into the different type of organizations, so that you can compare and contrast the similarities and differences, and hopefully take away some practices that could be beneficial and relevant for your organization. So without more further ado, I would like to introduce our panel today. First up, Dan from Zipco. Zipco is one of those companies, fintech, despite kind of listed on the ASX stock exchange, it still very much managed to maintain a scale-up culture. And then on our panel also, we have Mark from Safer Sooner Happier, who has previously led multiple agile transformations in what we would call the bigger organizations or incumbents, things like companies like the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, Suncorp, and Bankwest. So today's conversation is very much one with Dan, Mark, and the audience. So if you would like to pop in any questions in the chat, we'll be monitoring it. And there will be also some time at the end for Q&A. So welcome, Dan and Mark. Really a pleasure to have you today to talk about QBR with our audience here. So maybe we start by just share your experience about how QBR was first introduced into your organization and your personal experience with it.
Yeah, hey everyone, thanks for attending. Great to see everybody. So my role, I'm an Associate Director of Delivery, so I look after all things delivery, ways of working at Zip. We're a 10-year-old organization, and it would be fair to say that things have been very hectic for the first probably 8 or so years of the period of time, and we've kind of just been working through that maturity curve. How do we take a bunch of squads all working autonomously into something that's a bit more structured, organized, all working, all steering the ship in the same direction collectively and strategically. So yeah, my role is really like looking at how do we turn a 3-year strategy into something that's like an operational plan, which is more like an annual plan. And then how do we turn that into quarterly plans? And then how do all the teams ultimately take that context, understand the metrics, and really hypothesize, how do we actually make a dent against these outcomes that we're really trying to achieve? And we kind of self-organize with an element of governance over the top in order to get ourselves there. So yeah, that's really in a nutshell. I don't really run the QBR. That's more of an executives and teams thing that they run, but definitely I'm involved and take those inputs and outputs to help support how we manage ourselves on a quarterly, moving into the annual basis.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. Lovely to see everyone today. My name's Mark Payne. I'm the principal consultant with Sooner Safer Happier. My exposure to QBRs actually started all the way back at Bankwest, when Bankwest was going through its agile transformation journey. We made the move in Bankwest to restructure the organisation and set up an operating model that was built more around tribes, chapters, and squads. The first move we made in terms of the ways of working was instigating the quarterly planning process for our tribes and squads and platforms to operate within. But noticed very, very quickly that there was a step missing before that, which was actually the context and the direction that was required for those tribes, platforms, and squads to then operate within. And over a series of quarters, we evolved that quarterly planning process to introduce the QBR, the quarterly business review. And through that quarterly business review design, we implemented a cadence and a set of ceremonies that ultimately got us towards a point where the squads were able to plan and execute, similar to what Dan was describing. And from the time we started to approximately 3 years later, through refining that process, we were able to deliver the value that we agreed to year on year, but we were also able to double the volume of change through the system as well, through making sure that we had the right volume, the right work going through there. And then ever since then, I've been refining those learnings and working with different organisations to help them implement the QBR process that's right for their organisation.
So it sounds like Zip as a company, that's more of an evolution, right? It started with, okay, we need some mechanism as we scale and grow the complexity of the organization. We need something to gel essentially the strategy with the work itself. So it's more of an organic act that formalized over time, versus from a, like Bankwest, for example, it sounds more like a revolution, which is, hey, we actually want to fundamentally change the way we work. And QBR is one of those mechanisms that can help us get there. Like, is that kind of what you're saying? And how would that actually work differently in practice?
Yeah, it's a great call. I would say that the Bankwest change was still evolutionary. It was the right next step in the organization's direction, because it was ultimately trying to answer the question, did it want to do more digital work, or did it want to be more of a digital organization? And you can kind of go down two different paths in that regard. And luckily they chose the digital organization. So they wanted to be a bit more Zip-like in, fintech in the way that it operated. And so I guess the first step on that journey was thinking about the organization working within a quarterly cadence. And that was kind of the first step. But in instilling that first step, it was, how do we ensure that our teams are then working on the right things? And then what that evolved into was, and this is going back into the days when it was physical rooms that we could set up, was we started to visualize the portfolio in a room. Within the first quarter, we realized that visualization was wrong. And to your point, Ewan, we weren't quite connecting the work to strategy. So we pivoted on that wall design and started to look at an Abaya style concept design. Hopefully most people are familiar with Abayas from Toyota, Lean Six Sigma, and how those things kind of came together. And as we started to visualize that work, instead of going down the path of plan, do, check, act, we started to flip that a little bit to be about check, act, plan, do. So we started the check process that ultimately drove the QBR design. And then we started to think about the levels in the organization and how those things kind of flowed and came together. So yes, it started and then started to evolve the design as we started to learn.
Dan, is that your experience as well, or you kind of evolve in a slightly different way?
Yeah, I think like we're ground up fintech. So there's really never been like the transformation type programs of work that was needed in the organization. We were lucky really that our co-founders kind of embraced agile from day one. And they were very scrappy and they were very, hands-on from those early days. And naturally they had a lot of great ideas and they wanted their ideas to be prioritized. And then over time, we started to get more and more specialized roles within the organization, specialist product managers, specialist product designers, specialist engineers and directors. And then the organization grew and grew. And I've only been here for about 3.5, 4 years now, but my understanding of the previous history to the point where I came in and I've kind of, started to be much more involved in the way that our process was, it was always, we had the concept of OKRs, like for at least the last 5 years, we've always worked with OKRs, that's objectives and key results. And that was really about measuring the outcomes of any input that you provide into the systems. And the teams would always measure themselves via OKRs. And, really we've matured our OKRs over time. So we set better OKRs, we set more strategic OKRs, we get better at the governance at the end of the quarter to make sure that the OKRs were hit. And we've built a lot of internal custom tooling. But even with all of that, as we've evolved from that kind of like ground up founder-led and start to put layers of improvement around the planning practices and the prioritization practices, and then starting to become more strategic and even started to look at like our group structures, groups of squads, and where are they best fit? Do people need to potentially be a bit more fungible about like which spaces that they can operate within, and teams and squads, how do they operate differently? It's been very much like that, very kind of open-ended way of working, but then the layers came on top of like the QBR has been a relatively like new thing, I think, for us as an organization, probably over the last 1 to 2 years really is where the QBR came in. And in doing that, it was really about a plan on a page, an annual plan on a page. All right, what does the organization need to do to succeed? What are those key measures, business measures that we need to do to succeed? Then once the context is in place and the metrics to measure ourselves, we already had those quarterly plans and the quarterly rituals, et cetera, that Mark was talking about. We really just kind of like brought them together. And then it just almost like was the next layer. It was like the launch pad for improving everything that we did, because all those strategic decisions were now being, with context, being translated into measurable ways to move forward. And then the QBRs and our quarterly OKRs were really, how do we actually track progress? Are we actually moving the needle like we said we did? And all of the learnings, all of the sharing, the psychologically safe to not get it quite right, and inspect and adapt, pretty much everything that we do really just naturally evolved as part of the two coming together, the QBR, the annual planning process.
And just to like build Dan, Yuan, if that's okay, because this is where Dan and I caught up earlier in the week. Or was it late last week? And we were talking, and there is such similarities in the way that Dan's doing it, except that as you see it in other organizations, and some of the missing things that we see in other organizations is actually that glue, and Dan's described it perfectly as the OKR, which is actually around the strategy and then the execution and then the OKR in the middle. What we've seen in other organizations is when you've got more layers into the organization is you'll hear that term empowerment. The teams are empowered, to execute, but empowerment can also take you down a path of working on the wrong things. And so what we're trying to do with organizations at the moment, and exactly what Dan's describing, is how do we now define the OKRs at the various levels? And in Sooner Safer Happier, we refer to that as the golden thread of value. And so we work with organizations also now to think about how do you set multi-year OKRs, to Dan's point, what are the annual OKRs that we're going after? And then how do you nest within those, the quarterly OKRs? So if anything that you're taking away from this session today, I would definitely latch on to what Dan has said about the OKRs as being a key element in the QBR process. Sorry, Yuan.
No worries. You actually just dive into a topic that I think the audience is really keen to understand as well, which is really around aligning the organization or coordinating the almost like the planning cycles that what is quarterly, so you have to almost like anchor it around a certain time stamp. So it's like, how do you actually do that across organization from a planning cycle point of view, from people involvement and also input point of view?
Dan, did you want to go first, mate?
Yeah, I was going to say, who goes first? So yeah, absolutely. And it's quite funny, when we were chatting late last week, we've actually come to the same solution, even though we're working in different organizations. So we have the calendar year. And at the end of the calendar year, traditionally, we get the next annual plan. And that annual plan has all those core metrics. We, as a product organization, we want to get new customers. We want to do more with the existing customers that we've got. And we want that to drive revenue, and you want to reduce like our cost to serve and all those kind of things that, you look after the unit economics and the risk reduction in the business. So there's those kind of, as that gets generated and issued with a lot of, bottom up feeding into that too, from like directors and teams, that gets issued at the end of the calendar year. So because that's issued just at the end of the calendar year, it's very difficult to do your quarterly plan during that period. So what we did is we effectively offset our quarterly planning a month afterwards. So effectively, you get the annual plan, the quarterly planning cycle then kicks in. And then based on that, we have that effectively the next 3 months from there onwards. So that would be August, September, October would be our Q1 effectively. And then by the end of that, so during that planning period, we very much align to the strategic context of what we're trying to achieve as an organization. It shouldn't really be a surprise because, a lot of it's continuation from previous years. And we have this concept of top cross-functional initiatives. So there's some really big focus area thematics for the year that aren't going to go away. Some of them might last the whole year. Some of them might last a half year. But then we would almost like sequence them out, which are the highest TCFIs, as we call them, for the first half. And then we kind of stack rank them. And then teams will organize around within those thematics. But the thematics aren't to tell you deliver X or Y. It's like we need to do something to deliver some sort of outcome to some sort of value as part of our organization. The teams then come up with they'll do the necessary discovery work by talking to our customers, using all the data analytics, etc. And then from that, they would come up with a set of ideas, initiatives, hypotheses that they would want to prioritize. And again, they would have to stack rank those priorities as well within the TCFI. So it's this like nested set of priorities. And then we just start delivering on them quarter by quarter. And then within our quarterly planning cycles, what we do is say, right, if this is our top 5 list, what are all the dependencies across all the various different teams across the organization? Let's bring them to the surface and let's get them prioritized as part of this journey. And then we kind of like set the rituals in place in quarter, scrums or weekly synchronization calls, those kind of things where we actually get the broader organization coming together. And if it's we might have rituals in place, like, fortnightly demos for the whole organization within that TCFI, for example. So we definitely try to bring that like holistic collaborative approach in quarter. And then as that quarter's nearing the end, the QBR as part of the calendar year kicks in. We understand, have we made meaningful progress or not? And then following that QBR, then we do the next quarterly planning process again. So the annual plan feeds the quarterly plan. The next QBR feeds that planning process. And then it just keeps going in those cycles. And then your rituals are at that kind of like organizational level, but then all the teams do sequence sprints as well. So everyone's sprints start the same start and end dates. And then we have a 1 week period at the end of the quarter because there's 13 weeks in a quarter. And everyone gets a little bit of a downtime, decompression, do a bit of team building, that kind of stuff. And then it all really just starts that cycle over and over again. So Mark, it sounds like you've kind of come to that sort of similar process, right, in different organizations.
Yeah, and definitely first-hand experience at Bankwest, very, very similar, Dan, and that was for about 3,000-ish people. You take that pattern and then you think about how it then scales at, organizations with, different sizes and more people. Couple of builds from me, when we were starting to think about scale, but the first one was we did exactly the same thing as what Dan described, which was to offset the timing in terms of the quarter and when things kind of kicked off. So what we did was we didn't change the financial reporting cycle. So that followed the calendar year cycle and ultimately the financial year cycle. But to Dan's point, we then offset the delivery cycle by about 6 weeks, I think it was. I can't remember the exact time frame. So what that enabled, exactly what Dan said, was key decisions to be made around financial. And then you've got time around a 6-week window to flow that into delivery. And then what we then did at Bankwest, and I look at this pattern when I go into other organizations, is if you take that window, it's then how do you then allow those financial decisions to be made, but then the exco or the business unit lead or however the right person in the organization is, they cascade that direction. Like these are the pivots, these are the adjustments, these are the directions that we want to go. And then, as Dan was saying, the teams then start to think about, well, how am I going to meet this change in direction? And so the QBR itself isn't just one mighty ta-da forum. It's actually a series of smaller forums that connect together that get you to, here's the decision that's made on where we're needing to go. And ING articulated it quite nicely, and I've latched onto it when I've heard it. They called it vertical alignment versus horizontal alignment. So vertical alignment is, are we changing the direction that we want to go in? Are we working on the right things? So how do we set the direction on the work and the things that we need to achieve? So that's the vertical alignment. And then the horizontal alignment is, do we have the capacity in the right spot to be able to execute on that? So how do we make decisions then at an individual capability or resource level to look at it? So your QBR starts to break into two elements there: vertical alignment, horizontal alignment, and then ultimately into planning. So if you're using big room planning or whatever those techniques are, allowing the teams to then execute on the back of, and then everything Dan said is, how do you build the ways of working into your governance to then monitor your plans and ultimately tie back in the cycle feeds itself all over again. But the key call out here is, one of the key call outs is the whole organization moves into the same cadence. But you may not necessarily need to change all ceremonies, forums, and meetings across the organizations. You just need to adapt the relevant ones that enable that flow in delivery. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, just one other thing as well, as inputs into the QBR shouldn't really be a surprise to the organization, right? If you hit 3 months and you go, oh, what the hell? Like, where did that come from? We didn't realize we were so far behind a specific target. We also have those weekly asynchronous, so different product managers are posting the latest metrics in the channels and doing month-on-month, week-on-week trends. Might share charts if people are interested. And then we have like the monthly cycle where we have like a monthly review as well. So really, like, everyone's keeping on top of their metrics weekly. They're understanding what inputs are leading to better outputs and what aren't. The monthly helps keep check of the business metric. And then by the time you hit the quarterly, well, there's not really a surprise there. So that actually makes the QBR actually very lean for us as an organization. We only really spend about 1.5 hours on the QBR with the executives and the directors for that very reason.
On that point, Dan, maybe Mark as well, can you elaborate a little bit around the inputs or the information exchange or sharing that's required? Because that sounds like a key part of QBR is building on common understanding or have enough insights to understand where the potential misalignment might be or where we actually want to provide more context, right? Because a lot of organizations that may not have all the system and data and communication in place, that could actually become a massive chore for everyone quarter on quarter to get that ready. So what are some of the tips you may have to help address that?
Do you want to take that, Mark, first? Or
yeah, I can jump in. Sure. I'll jump in first, mate. That sounds good. Sure. So there's a couple of things here, and some of them are quite big, but not really big, but you have to face into them. So I think the first one that we faced into was we didn't necessarily need an EPMO anymore at Bankwest, because EPMOs were ultimately about the dollars and the widgets, and were the widgets getting done. And what we pivoted towards was, and in terms of using Sooner Safer Happier terminology, was more of a value realization office. So how are you then monitoring the outcomes to Dan's point earlier around the OKR. So how are we checking in using data and metrics and insights to ensure that, we're delivering the value that we needed. In order to do that, but to your point, Ewan, there's data that's required. So what we did was, and we didn't have a tool to do this, we just had a very nice spreadsheet, and our VRO expert built the spreadsheet, but it was ultimately about bringing the data in around the outcome performance, how are things tracking, where are we going, where's the trend lines, but it wasn't looking at it as in this quarter we said we were going to do it, we didn't do it. It was more about trend lines. And so you're actually looking at the trending data. And so if it's trending backwards, then, you've definitely got to do something. Whereas if it's trending green, but, there's slight waves to it, that's okay. And then it was about, okay, well, now we need to bring in the work data. So what is the work that we're thinking about doing for the next quarter, and how does that align to the outcomes, and how will it either improve the trend line or continue to enhance the trend line? And then once you started to marry up that information, it was then about, okay, now let's look at our supply. Do we have our workforce in the right spots, working on the right things? And that then leads to, when I talk about that horizontal alignment, doability reviews. And so that doability then enables decision-making as to what pivots and adjustments that you want to make. And then ultimately, if they can't be handled at the various levels, you're ultimately building those towards like an enterprise level QBR. And to Dan's point, they can be quite quick because you've actually built the reviews and the mechanisms all the way through the data capture. So a couple of things there. One is think about the role of your EPMO or your PMO office and how it can help facilitate the cadence and the data that it needs to come into. And then how do you think about that collation of data driving the insights and then ultimately the decisions? And how do you bring them into the right forum at the right levels? Dan, I don't know if you've got any builds or if you go in a slightly different direction than Zip.
Yeah, I'll try to give some practical examples. So our 3-year strategy really lives in a slide pack, and that's fine because it's there when it's needed to be, and it gets refined and updated. Our annual plan, the way that works is each of our various different business units ultimately writes like a 4 to 6 pager. What are they planning for the year, and how does that ladder up to the overall strategy? And then our head of strategy and operations, he goes away and he ultimately reviews each of those individual operating plans, and he's looking for common threads. That horizontal piece, he's looking for the common threads, the things that make sense, the things that maybe are going to be a challenge if he just gets a sort of grip that it doesn't look like we're going to be able to resource that, for example. So he does a lot of that due diligence up front. Based on that, works very closely with our executive committee that formulates the annual plan. And that annual plan is based on budgeting, forecasting, all that kind of stuff, and some semi-aggressive goals, some very aggressive goals, and some moderate goals. And then based on that, then, and that just lives on a slide, and it's a single slide. We call it the plan on a page. It's just one page, and it just articulates very high level the context of what we need to achieve in the organization. And then we have things like our monthly all hands ceremonies and stuff like that. So where the relevant one lands, we weave that in there. They'll take the operating committee through it in more detail. The teams have their own individual meetings where they can talk about it in detail, what it means to them. So there's very like that sort of, the stuff going on all the way through the organization, cascading through. And then we've built our own custom tooling ultimately. And our custom tooling, what it does is we know every squad, we know roughly what capacity they have per quarter, and then we give them the guidance within the product and engineering leadership, specifically in my space. We have a top 10 list. Like, here's the top 10 sort of key focus areas for us as an organization for this quarter, or at least for the next half. And then the teams themselves will ultimately will organize them around broadcasting, issuing out that list of priorities. So that means that if some squads are leading those big focus areas, they're going to do a lot of the necessary grunt work to sort of, scope it out, understand what we're trying to do, explain the why behind what we're going to do, and setting up the OKRs. They'll need to engage and bring all the dependency teams in place to make sure that they're aligned, they're across the detail. They can put some level of estimates in for the quarter to say, yeah, okay, we can cover probably 2 of those dependencies against that focus area, 2 of them against that one. We've got a couple of things where we need to do ourselves. Every team gets 15% allocation for just BAU and tech debt and things like that. What have we got left? You know, ultimately we get that sort of like tooling that helps us to say, here's the green list we got high confidence on. Here's like the red list, which is a definite no. And there's some things in between that if we get to them, that's cool. But, you know, no one's going to sort of not hit anyone on the head and say, why didn't you do that one? Because it was never going to be like fully committed to in the first place. It's like a best endeavors approach. But then when we do get those really critical ones, we then make sure, like my team as a delivery team, we'll make sure the relevant sub cross-functional initiative has its own rituals in place and it's cross-functional in nature. Maybe we need to work out how to break them into work streams. If squads can't do it independently and autonomously, of course, but then we'll need to engage all the relevant other teams like legal and all that. So they manage their sprints in Jira. There's a separate tool and we've been in-house built to do the quarterly planning. And then really everything else above and beyond that is really like slide packs. And then it just feeds into those rituals that we've both talked about. But you'll notice it's not about delivering X and X. It's really about, we want to deliver the outcomes, right? And there's that bottom up and top down collaboration to work out what is our best chances of success, because nothing's a guarantee in life.
That's probably bringing a bit of a white elephant moment into this conversation. I'm going to ask you something quite controversial, because so far we talk about the cadence, we talk about the importance of having OKRs as a way to measure success as opposed to the widgets. But at the same time, you know, a lot of organizations today talking about widgets or having the top-down pushing, you know, widget completion or having that controlling culture is still quite a common practice. So how do you actually, what are the things that you can do to help, you know, particularly executive leadership, shifting the culture towards outcome-driven and also keep it that way, particularly when, you know, this high stress situations?
I think that's one for Mark, first and foremost.
Yeah, okay. It is an interesting one because if you think about the need for change and QBRs are only quarterly, you only get one shot every 3 months. So you need to, I guess, manage expectations that it's going to be a longer term behavioural change that, you know, is expected at that more senior level. The way I've always started is to start with, it's not overloading them with things like the OKRs and those kind of things, but bringing them into the cadence first. And I know you and we were trying to deviate the conversation there, but we've got to bring them into the cadence to give them a role to start with. And their role is to set direction. And initially their direction will be to, can you deliver widget X or Y or whatever it might be? But if you think about what we've been talking about with the timing between QBRs, there's a cadence of things that need to happen. And so if you think about potentially planning for the QBR starting, say, maybe 6 weeks out, that's when you can start your first intervention with senior leaders and start to introduce, okay, can we look at defining an OKR or even a goal or a ninja move that Marie and I talk about is if the organization's oriented around KPIs, is the KPIs start to form a lagging indicator in OKRs. So you may not have all your OKRs drafted with the objective and the leading indicators, but you've now got a template with lagging indicators into it. And then, you know, the next QBR might be then how do we start to write the objective? So I think so my advice here is you've got to meet them where they're at. And then build it into your cadence and your process ceremonies and flows around when you're going to introduce them to things. Because we were probably 2 quarters in at Bankwest, and for the 3rd quarter, that's when we went to the Exco, and we didn't talk OKRs, but we talked about goals. You know, to make sure that the tribes and the squads are now working on the right things. How can we reorient this to be more about goals, and they'll come to you with the work. And then we were able to do that big pivot in Bankwest to the first proper QBR at that point. Hopefully that makes sense.
Dan, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I've been lucky enough that because we've been kind of ground up agile, we've really, it's been that evolution really. And this is just really kind of like refining it. You know, there's that great quote about like, you've got the pirates and then you've got the Navy. And like the pirates are like your startups and they're taking risks and there's less compliance and things like this to worry about. So they've come from the world of pirates turning into a scale up. Now, you don't want to be like the Navy, whereby no decision making can be made without, you know, the very top making every single decision. But there's that really good common ground, which is like the Navy SEALs, right? Which is very coordinated. But each team has got the skills and the context to do their mission specifically, relatively autonomously, not completely, but relatively autonomously. So really, like, our step was really going from the pirates to the Navy SEALs. We don't want to be the Navy because that would just be too slow for us. So what's that common middle ground for us that helps us to elevate ourselves from the startup world to the scale-up world? So it really was just helping our executive team get organized, really, and then put the rituals and practices in place and the tooling and make sure the relevant data has been surfaced in Tableau. And we've got tools like Amplitude and stuff like that, so we can track all these meaningful progress. So it really just helped everyone get more organized, but in a semi-autonomous way. So there wasn't a hard sell. It was just the obvious next step, I guess, for us as a scale up.
And Dan, what I love about what you said is we're trying to go in the opposite direction. So it's trying to go from the Navy, not necessarily to pirate, but we're actually trying to get to the same destination.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the bit that we look at going from Navy down is the introduction of the OKRs. And how do you then start to see that shift from here's the widget I need you to deliver to here's the objective, and it may come with a lagging indicator, which is the KPI, and that's that first step, and then we start them on the journey. So again, mate, we're aligned again on that one without even knowing.
Yeah, I mean the OKRs are really, as you say, that's the pixie dust, right? You know, that's really what brings a different level of thinking within any organization, because you start to move away. And I've seen this pattern from some of the discussions we've had with different organizations. And from my observations from talking to larger organizations, you have this thing where you have these like annual budgets and projects are funded for, and then those projects don't deliver on the outcomes that they promised. And then the executives take more control, and then they tell you what to do, and they tell you how to deliver the next project, and they give you the funding for that project. And there's this death spiral of nobody having autonomy and no one quite understanding why we're delivering something that everyone else is telling us to deliver. You just become ticket takers, right? All right, I'm going to do this because the big boss told me to do it. And it's just this complete anti-pattern to really what you want, which is if you can empower your squads, and we have that concept of the product triad, right? Which is the engineer manager, the product manager, the product designer. If you want to even level that up even further, get some analytics person in there and get someone like a product marketer in there. And that cross-functional skill set paired with your engineers and someone who's focused on the quality side of things, they, especially if they're talking to their customers and they know their data well enough, they're going to have such better ideas than some executive who has no ideas and no context and all the rest of it about the customers that they're actually serving. So it's like, it just to me seems madness if you're being told as a specialist with like specialist skill set who really understands your customers to being told what to do. It just doesn't make sense, right? It's just crazy, really. So I think the OKRs shift the balance back a little bit to say, well, let's align on what outcome we want to deliver together. Trust us that we're going to start to deliver against those outcomes. We might not get it right first quarter. We might not even set the right OKRs for the first 2-3 quarters, but just trust us on the journey that if we keep meeting in the middle here and aligning on the outcomes, we'll do the relevant discovery work and generative research and what have you to actually understand, right, what are our best chances of success? And again, chances, right? They're bets, they're hypotheses. And it ain't always going to work well, but when they work well, you generally get like a 5x or 10x outcome that compared to that incremental 1-2% outcome that maybe some people are looking for.
On that one, then we actually got a question from the audience. Now we talk about, I feel like we probably need another session just about OKR deep dive and practicality and how to introduce that into particularly older, bigger organizations as well. But on that note, say if we do have the OKR or the outcomes defined and aligned in the organization, how do you coordinate the work across the various teams that need to be sequenced to meet that required outcome? Like, for example, like you need to build functionality across multiple systems. You need to then plan, your marketing campaigns around it, launching product, etc. Like, how would you still make that happen practically?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely starts with executives helping to drive focus. So when the executives are really get some, good alignment on what the focus areas are going to be for the organization for the year, and they tend to be strategic focused, that helps because it cuts out a lot of the noise and the other random dependencies and requests that everyone's kind of generating, and it helps to cut through what are the priorities. So when you can provide that annual priority, then you provide the quarterly priorities. Doesn't mean that teams aren't going to work for themselves and do their own bits and pieces of work and still do experiments and try lots of different things. But where there's a need to work on like the top focus areas, we then go in as a delivery team and go, okay, right, who do we need across the organization to deliver on this? What rituals do we need in place? Because each squad if it can work autonomously, I'm getting out of the way. I don't want to interfere with a squad who knows how to do their job. We'll just make sure that we're helping them set the right OKRs and in the right structure at the start of the quarter in our tooling, and make sure at the end of the quarter that the governance is in place. And if there's any sort of actions, blockers, or training of new people that are joining the team to help embed them in the organization, we'll just support them from that perspective. But then when you've got these big top cross-functional ones, like for example, we've recently launched a new product, we have to basically make sure that has every chance of success. So an assessment across the organization, who are we going to need? What are the rituals outside of individual team scrums that we need to implant? So things like scrum of scrums, weekly syncs, etc. Do we need steerco, like once a month or once a fortnight, where the executives are getting closer to what's going on here? And we just basically do like scalable governance and scalable rituals and things like that across the organization. If it's like those top 2 to 3 cross-functional initiatives in the quarter, you'll get me or one of my team actually actively being in there and doing all of that, grunt work, getting everyone aligned, making sure that we're aligned on OKRs, not for a squad, but for this TCFI. And then, just getting your hands dirty, getting stuck in and making sure that everyone's aligned. And then we also, to sort of reinforce that as well, like at the start of each quarter, each of those TCFIs has a presentation. This is what we want to deliver this quarter. These are what we're planning to do, etc. These are like, we try to get like various different teams like marketing, etc., to also talk and present together. So that way it brings that cohesion that we're on the same boat, we're all moving in the same direction. And it kind of just scales down from there. And then after that, it just becomes like, okay, so with the remaining capacity we've got, these are the sort of key areas that we're going to continue to focus on. So yeah, I mean, like just as an example of one that I've done recently, it's at least a half year, maybe a year. We aligned on the overall metric, then really like what are the monthly metrics, and then below that, what are all the behavioral metrics that we want our customers to do, to exhibit, in order to deliver on that product metric that delivers on the business metric. And then when we align the teams around that, then we go, okay, right, well, this set of the metrics, work stream 1's focused on, middle set of metrics, work stream 2, third set of metrics, work stream 3. What's our baselines? How do we want to increase to the next set in the OKRs? And then let's have separate set of work stream rituals for those 3 work streams, and then follow those scrum practices, like, fortnightly planning practices, prioritization calls, twice weekly syncs with all the various stakeholders across the business. And it just really creates that cross-functional like desire to get things done. And it also removes a lot of those blockers quickly, because the context is there for the team members, like the executives or the operating committee, that can actually, unblock where possible.
Mark, on that point, the organizations you work in are probably a few times bigger than Zipco. So when you have a bit more, a lot more people and probably potentially more layers involved, how would you still maintain that cohesion and sequencing things accordingly?
Yeah. So first step is, as I mentioned before, like, and similar to what Dan's doing, like the organization's got to be in the quarterly cadence. So it doesn't mean that everyone needs to form part of the quarterly business review, but everyone's operating within the quarterly cadence. If they're operating within the quarterly cadence, then you've got a chance of working out who needs to be involved in the QBR. And then in order to do that, it's then revolves around the data that you capture. And so one of the things that I encourage the PMOs or the VROs to think about with the data capture is the stage at which the work is at. And what I mean by that is the work for this quarter predominantly discovery? Is it exiting discovery, more going into delivery? Is it exiting delivery, needing to be launched in terms of value? Because that starts to then inform for teams or parts of the organization that are not necessarily embedded in delivery. They've got a chance of looking at what the list of work is and then actually going, oh, I'm really interested in initiative 1, 7, 9, 14, and 15, because I need to think about our go-to-market strategy, what marketing campaigns do we need to build, etc. So there's definitely something there around the data, the work, and the types. So that's one element. The other element is preceding that, we've spoken a little bit about outcomes, is you tend to see organizations, larger organizations set up with business type value streams and technology type value streams, or platforms versus tribes, those kind of concepts, depending on where you're set up. By having those outcomes defined and then understanding the work that's going through, the platforms can then actually readjust their plans around what is my capacity dedicated to run, what is my capacity dedicated to change, and they can also start thinking about, well, I need to still do some change for my own platform, but I also now need to think about the change that I need to deliver for someone else. So setting up the data in that regard allows you to aggregate it and bring the views. And then 90% of the time it comes out as hotspots and issues that need to be resolved, either from a dependency perspective in delivery or a go-to-market perspective or whatever it might be. But that's where, again, the execs can kind of come back in and then make the right calls on the behalf of the teams in the organization in terms of where we need to focus our efforts. But really important around how you set up that data capture every quarter to bring the information in.
Perfect. We started getting a few more questions from the audience, and please keep popping into the chats. There's one from Zach asking, what challenges have you encountered in getting active engagement from senior leadership? How did you address them, and what have you learned from that process? I think we talked a little bit about that before, and if there's any kind of examples that you can share, that'll be really valuable.
I'll just fire off one, I think. Yeah, I'll see if the other one comes to me. Most senior leaders are very time poor. So if there's an opportunity for them not to have to attend many steercos, and things can start to aggregate up into a forum or monthly forums that lead towards a QBR style event, that entices them. It doesn't mean that they're going to fully, yes, I'm committed and I'm convinced and I'm going to jump in, but they'll at least dip their toe in the water. And then if you can then, while their toes being dipped in the water, show them the data the right way, and then frame that data into the insights and the decisions that they need to make. That's the starting point that I've seen personally in relation to this is less steercos and an opportunity for them to manage delivery a little bit differently.
Yeah, I don't really think there's an awful lot of buy-in really per se. I think I completely agree with you, Mark, in that less steerco is the better, especially for your executives. But for sure, they're going to want to see progress against the focus areas or the big bets, etc. Right? Yeah, we've experimented a few different ways. We used to do like an OKR steerco, like so once a month, we basically got each squads to present what meaningful progress are they making against their OKRs, and then call out, where do you need help? Where do you support? So we took it away from the initiatives themselves and focused about, are you tracking well against your OKRs? But the engagement wasn't quite there, I don't think, on that level. So we've kind of, taken a lot of that away. And as long as like our directors and our CPO, CTO, etc., there's an element of trust within the organization that if the CPO, the CTO, and the directors are across what their squads are doing, then the executives will just inspect and adapt that through whatever forums they need. If it's a stakeholder for a specific focus area, great. If it's other stuff, it's probably more just part of like the monthly metrics review and making sure that, you know, we're making some progress there through that forum and those metrics.
Ewan, the second one came to me. Another ninja move that we had great success with at Bankwest was repurposing an existing forum to bring in some of this. So, for example, the Exco had a quarterly strategy deep dive day. We formed the QBR to be an agenda item as part of the quarterly strategy deep dive day. So it wasn't a new forum, if that made sense. It was built into the existing rhythms and existing ceremonies, and we're able to adapt to that level as well. And then they can then see it being part of their day-to-day as well.
Yeah, I've just remembered as well, actually, what our operating committee do, which is really a select group of the directors. They do track progress on a monthly basis against some of those key top cross-functional initiatives I talked about as well. So there's just a checkpoint just to say, are you red, amber, green against that there? And that really keeps it as lightweight as possible, so that there isn't this need to be always peering in and asking questions and things like that, and feeling like they can be engaged with those forums and that information instead.
Seems that we have Travis from the audience as well that would like to share his experience running QBR. Travis, are you there? Just getting off mute.
There we go. I think everyone hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so I run the quarterly business review at 7-Eleven. So we've been doing it for just over 2 years now. So probably just some of the snippets, because I know we're close to time, but just some of the snippets from our experience would be about 12 months in making that distinction with the KPIs and the OKRs. So when we were going through, we went very much through a quarterly cadence and lost view of the bigger picture. So the big change that we made was setting annual KPIs and then setting our OKRs each quarter, which were really turning the dial on the KPIs, and they were more action-orientated objectives. We've also introduced recently annual roadmaps, and we set them up quite simply, just in PowerPoints for each of the tribes and COEs in kind of basic Gants. And the reason for doing that was to give visibility of what's coming in the year, so people wouldn't get surprises. And we actually did use some of the old terminology of things in discovery, things in design, build, so that our chapter members, so the craft that people needed access to, particularly if they were flowing to work, could see what was coming in advance. And what we would do at the beginning of each of our QBRs is get those updated, those roadmaps. So if there'd been any change, people could see whether they didn't need to allocate the resource or did do that. So I think having that annual KPIs, having a view of annual roadmaps, which we've now taken from 12 to 18 months, and then setting your OKRs quarterly just helps to bring everyone on board. And the other part of our alignment is we're heavily reliant on our execs setting company OKRs, only about anywhere from, 12 to say 16, setting those at the beginning of each quarter, and then everyone falls in underneath those. So that helps just drive our priority. So just a snapshot, taking on all the commentary and some of the comments that I've seen on the chat.
Sounds like really good practices there, Travis. Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. We've done a similar concept of just thematic roadmaps, because I completely agree. If you only talk OKRs, people can kind of lose sight of really what the big picture is. So try to veer away as much as possible from actual roadmaps and Gants, because, you know, we're an agile world, but definitely having those thematic roadmaps and things like that, when you break it down by groups and stuff, I do think that's a really powerful visualization and communication mechanism for the broader organization.
Amazing. Thank you all. And Travis, I'm so glad that you jumped in there and volunteered, because this really is a collective conversation for everyone to be having.